regained consciousness on day 3 to a text from my mother. It read, "We put your car and all your jewelry as collateral for your brother's loan. $74,000 total. The bank had a deadline and you were unresponsive. It is already done. Do not be angry. Family helps family." I was 32 years old, lying in the intensive care unit at Indianapolis General, trying to breathe around a throat raw from 3 days on a ventilator. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the phone the nurse had just handed me. My grandmother's vintage rings, my 1969 Mustang, everything I had built and saved, handed over while I was fighting to keep my heart beating. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where we tell quiet stories about people who stop playing the designated victim and let the paperwork do the talking. If your family has ever treated your life like a resource for them to spend, you are going to want to stay for this one. Drop a comment and tell me your age and what city you are watching from. And be sure to subscribe. Now, let me take you back to that hospital bed. The fluorescent lights burned my eyes. A clear, fluid line dripped a steady rhythm into my bruised arm. I read that text twice. A normal son might have dropped the phone. He might have hit the call button, demanded an outside line, and screamed until his lungs gave out. I am a forensic financial consultant. I spend my days tracing corporate fraud and tearing apart shell companies. I did not scream. I closed my eyes, took a shallow breath, and watched my heart rate level out on the monitor beside me. The Mustang was a shell I had rebuilt piece by piece in my 20s, learning the engine with grease-stained hands. The rings were the only things my grandmother managed to keep when my grandfather passed away. My mother knew exactly what those assets meant to me. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of my phone. The screen unlocked. I bypassed my personal checking accounts and navigated straight to the Indiana Public Records portal. My fingers fumbled against the glass, slipping on the cold sweat coating my skin, but I managed to type in my own Social Security number. There it was, a uniform commercial code filing, a commercial lien. It had been registered yesterday afternoon, right around the time my doctors were debating whether I would survive the night. The lien secured a commercial business loan issued to my older brother Liam's logistics company. I locked the screen. The financial architecture of what my mother had just done mapped itself out in my mind with terrifying clarity. Commercial lenders do not accept a 14-year-old generalized power of attorney form to collateralize new high-risk corporate debt. I knew this because I drafted these protocols for a living. The compliance department would have rejected a teenage signature in 10 seconds. Patricia and Liam had not just bent a legal rule to help family, they had actively forged my signature to bypass a federal banking protocol. I let my head sink into the thin, starchy hospital pillow. My lungs ached with every fractional breath. My family had not gathered in the waiting room to pray for a recovery. They had hovered over my hospital bed, waiting for me to stop breathing so they could strip my life for parts. The nurse walked back in to check my vitals. She smiled gently and asked if I needed her to dial anyone from my emergency contacts. I looked at the steady green line on the monitor. I told her no. I did not need to make a call. I needed to build a trap. The morning of the 4th day arrived with the hollow scrape of a cleaning cart outside my door. My hospital discharge was scheduled for the following afternoon. I spent those early hours staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, mapping out the precise corporate structure of my brother's logistics firm in my head. I knew Liam. He ran businesses the way he ran his personal life, loud, reckless, and forever dependent on someone else to cover his margins. I was calculating the debt-to-income ratio required to force a commercial lien when the heavy wooden door to my room pushed open. The sharp, rhythmic click of low heels against the linoleum signaled her arrival before I even turned my head. It was my mother, Patricia. She did not rush to my bedside. She did not drop her purse or reach for my hand with tears in her eyes. Instead, she paused near the foot of the bed, her gaze flicking toward the blank television screen mounted on the wall, using its dark reflection to briefly check the alignment of her silk scarf. Cradled in her left arm was a small bouquet wrapped in cheap, crinkling cellophane, pink carnations. The stems were uneven, the petals already fraying at the edges. They were the kind of flowers you grab from a gas station bucket on the drive over a transactional gesture, purchased only to fulfill a social requirement. She stepped forward and laid the plastic-wrapped bundle on the rolling tray table beside my bed. The carnations sat there, fragile and cheap, a perfect physical manifestation of how much effort my survival actually warranted in her schedule. I noted the detail and filed it away. When you spend your career auditing fraudulent behavior, you learn that the smallest discrepancies reveal the largest truths. A mother, terrified of losing her youngest son, does not buy discount carnations. She pulled the single plastic visitor chair closer to the bed. The metal legs scraped harshly against the floor. She sat down, smoothing the crease of her tailored slacks. Her posture was rigid professional. She looked less like a parent visiting an intensive care unit and more like a loan officer preparing to close a difficult quarter. "You look pale, George," she said. Her tone carried the breezy cadence she normally reserved for discussing the weather at her country club luncheons. "But the doctors say the worst is behind us. We were all very worried." I did not answer. My throat was still a ruined landscape of raw tissue, but my silence was strategic. I let her fill the quiet. People who are hiding something hate a vacuum. They will always speak to fill it, and in doing so, they give away their position. She shifted in her chair, reaching into her designer tote bag. "Liam sends his best, of course. He is buried in logistical nightmares this week. The supply chain issues are just brutal right now." She drew a pristine manila folder from the bag and placed it next to the wilted carnations. "We had a bit of a scramble while you were under the weather. Liam needed a bridge loan to keep his shipping contracts afloat. The bank was being stubborn about the collateral timelines." She offered a tight, practiced smile. Thankfully, I stepped in. I utilized my perfect 800 credit score to smooth the ruffled feathers. I spoke with the regional manager, leveraged my reputation, and we got it handled. Family has to protect family. My eyes dropped to the manila folder. I knew exactly what was inside before she even touched the cover. She was trying to cure a federal crime. By forging my signature on the commercial pledge, she had committed felony wire fraud. She needed me to sign a post-dated authorization, a legal ratification of the contract, to retroactively validate her maneuver. If I signed whatever was in that folder, I surrendered my right to claim theft. I stared at the edge of the paper peeking out from the cardboard sleeve, and suddenly the sterile smell of the hospital vanished. I was not in Indianapolis anymore. I was 18 years old, sitting at the polished oak kitchen table in the house I grew up in. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the floorboards. My high school diploma was sitting on the counter. Patricia had placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of me, followed by a thick stack of stapled pages. I could still hear the exact pitch of her voice from that day 14 years ago. "It is just a general power of attorney, Georgie," she had said, tapping the signature line with a heavy brass pen. "Just a precaution. You are riding that motorcycle now. If you ever get hurt, if you are ever in an accident and cannot make decisions, I need the legal right to pay your medical bills and manage your affairs. It is just in case." Just in case. She had held on to that document for a decade and a half. She had kept it filed away, a dormant weapon, waiting for the exact moment I was vulnerable enough to exploit. She did not use it to pay my medical bills. She used it to hand my grandmother's diamonds and the only vehicle I cared about to a commercial bank so her favorite son could keep playing businessman. The memory dissolved, replaced by the harsh fluorescent reality of the intensive care unit. Patricia flipped the manila folder open. The crisp white pages were dense with legal boilerplate. "The bank just needs a routine confirmation for their compliance file," she said smoothly. She unclipped a silver pen from the collar of her blouse and held it out toward me. "Just a few signatures here at the bottom, George. It clears up the paperwork since you were indisposed during the actual transfer." She leaned closer. I could smell the sharp, expensive notes of her perfume. It was an ambush. She was banking on my physical exhaustion, assuming I would simply scribble my name to get her out of the room so I could sleep. I looked at the pen. I looked at the line of ink required to sign away my grandmother's legacy. I needed a shield, and my broken body provided the perfect one. I let my hand tremble naturally. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a shallow, raspy groan, allowing my head to roll back against the pillow. I did not have to fake the cold sweat on my forehead. "Mom," I whispered, letting my voice crack and fade. "My head, it is splitting." She kept the pen extended. "It will only take 2 seconds, George. Just sign right there on the yellow tab." I forced my breathing to turn ragged. I blinked rapidly, squinting at the pages, as if I were trying to decipher a foreign language. "I cannot see the print. The letters are swimming. The medication they gave me this morning, it is making everything blur." I let my trembling hand drop back onto the thin blanket. "Leave it on the tray. Let me sleep the medication off. I will look at it when my vision clears." I spoke politely, playing the role of the weak, compliant son she expected me to be. For a fraction of a second, the polished socialite facade cracked. Patricia's jaw tightened so severely I could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. A micro-expression of pure panic flashed across her eyes. She needed that signature before I left this room. She needed the legal cure. But she could not force the pen into my hand without dropping her mask of maternal concern. She slowly pulled the silver pen back, capping it with a sharp, angry click. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all its breezy warmth. "Rest, but do not forget about them. The bank is waiting on these." She stood up, grabbed her designer tote bag, and walked toward the door. She did not say goodbye. She did not tell me she loved me. She just walked out. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. I waited 10 seconds. Then I forced my aching body to move. I reached past the cheap pink carnations and grabbed my phone. My chest burned with every millimeter of movement, but the adrenaline overrode the pain. I opened the camera application. I pulled the manila folder onto my lap. My hands were still shaking, but I managed to steady the lens. I photographed the first page. I flipped the sheet and photographed the second. I captured every single paragraph of the unsigned retrospective authorization forms. I captured the date lines, the bank letterhead, and the specific terms of the collateral pledge. I secured the hard, irrefutable evidence of her federal wire fraud. I slid the folder back onto the tray, falling back against the pillows, gasping for air. She thought she had left me with a chore. She did not realize she had just handed me the rope I would use to hang her. I had the proof, but proof means nothing if the antagonist decides to strike before you are ready. And 2 weeks later, the bank decided to strike. 2 weeks after my discharge, the quiet of my downtown apartment offered a fragile sanctuary. Healing was not a graceful process. Every breath required conscious effort, drawing air into lungs that still felt lined with sandpaper from the intubation tube. I spent my days seated at the kitchen island, tracking my physical recovery alongside the digital footprints of my brother's Logistics Limited Liability Company. The heavy knock at my front door shattered the silence of a late Tuesday afternoon. I set down my coffee mug, my hand still plagued by a slight tremor, and walked toward the entryway. The courier in the hall held a clipboard and a stiff cardboard envelope. Certified mail, signature required. I signed my name with a rigid grip, took the parcel, and locked the deadbolt behind me. The return address bore the embossed logo of a prominent regional commercial bank. I did not need a letter opener. I tore the perforated tab across the top and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the first page read, notice of default, and intent to seize collateral. I scanned the itemized ledger printed beneath the legal headers. Liam had missed a payment. It was not the 6th payment or the 12th. He had defaulted on the inaugural installment of the $74,000 bridge loan, $1,800. My older brother could not even scrape together the liquidity to cover the first 30 days of interest. The business was not just failing, it was functionally bankrupt, a hollow shell bleeding cash faster than he could borrow it. I flipped to the 3rd page, tracing my index finger down the collection schedule. The clause detailed the immediate authorization to repossess the secured assets to mitigate the lender risk. I knew commercial banking procedures intimately. When a high-value vehicle is flagged for repossession due to a hard default, the bank issues the order to a third-party recovery agency immediately. Tow trucks operating under these specific commercial warrants execute their seizures during the lowest risk hours to avoid confrontation. Dawn, 6 in the morning. I glanced at the digital clock on my microwave. It was currently 10 at night. I had exactly 8 hours before a flatbed truck backed into my assigned space in the parking garage downstairs. A cold, familiar clarity washed over me, pushing the physical ache in my chest to the background. Liam never understood the true weight of an asset because he never had to build one from the ground up. Growing up, our parents treated his failures as minor stumbles, deserving of instant financial cushions. When he wrecked his brand-new sedan at 19, Patricia bought him a replacement vehicle within the week. When his first real estate venture collapsed, she liquidated her own retirement shares to cover his bad checks. I chose a different path. I bought a rusted 1969 Mustang chassis from an Ohio junkyard for $800 when I was 22. I spent 4 years of weekends in a drafty garage, grinding away oxidation, sourcing original engine components, and rebuilding the carburetor until the grease was permanently etched into the lines of my palms. That car was the physical manifestation of my autonomy. It represented thousands of hours of solitary grit. It was the single object in my world that belonged solely to my own labor. And my mother had traded it away to float her favorite son for one more doomed financial quarter. I was not going to let a repo agent hook a winch to my independence. At 2 in the morning, the city of Indianapolis was a ghost town. I stood up from the kitchen stool. Fire traced a jagged line down my sternum as I stretched my stiff muscles. The atrophy from the hospital bed rest made my legs feel like hollow lead pipes. I pulled a heavy canvas jacket over my shoulders to ward off the biting autumn chill and grabbed my keys from the ceramic bowl by the door. Every step down the long corridor to the elevator required a calculated, agonizing intake of oxygen. The concrete parking garage beneath my building was damp, echoing with the hum of distant ventilation fans. My assigned space was near the back wall. The Mustang sat beneath a fitted canvas cover, a low, dormant silhouette in the shadows. I peeled the heavy fabric back. The polished metallic blue paint caught the dim fluorescent lighting overhead. I opened the heavy steel door and slid into the driver's seat. The cold vinyl sent a sharp shiver up my spine. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. The deep, guttural vibration of the 8-cylinder motor rattled right through my bruised ribs. The pain was sharp, breathless, and incredibly grounding. I shifted the transmission into gear and eased out of the subterranean garage, emerging onto the empty, frost-covered asphalt of the city streets. You do not beat a commercial bank by hiding a vehicle in a friend's driveway. You defeat them with superior architecture. During my 2 weeks of bed rest, I had not merely been staring at the wall. I had utilized a secure, encrypted connection to establish a blind, irrevocable trust registered in Delaware. I drafted the formation documents myself, employing a registered corporate agent to mask the true ownership. Earlier that week, I legally transferred the title of the Mustang into the trust. The car no longer belonged to George Ember. It belonged to an anonymous corporate entity shielded from personal commercial liens. The local repo agent dispatched to my apartment would only possess the original fraudulent filing bearing my name. When they ran the current vehicle identification number through the state database, they would hit a solid brick wall of corporate privacy laws. I drove toward the industrial district on the far western edge of the city. The streetlights flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. I navigated through an area dominated by windowless warehouses and chain-link fences until I reached a sprawling, high-security storage facility. I had leased a climate-controlled private unit under the name of the New Trust. I pulled up to the security gate and punched the access code into the keypad. The metal barrier slid open with a heavy mechanical groan. I idled the car down a long, narrow row of identical corrugated metal doors. Unit 412. I stepped out, the crisp night air biting at my lungs, and unlocked the heavy padlock. I rolled the metal door upward, the screech of the tracks echoing in the silent corridor. I drove the Mustang inside the dark concrete bay. I turned the key, killing the engine. The sudden silence that followed was profound ringing in my ears. I stepped out of the vehicle, running my hand along the cool metal of the hood one last time before stepping back into the freezing alleyway. I reached up, grabbed the handle, and pulled the heavy rolling door downward. It latched at the bottom with a final, echoing metallic clang. I threaded the heavy steel padlock through the hasp and snapped it shut. The physical exertion of the last hour finally caught up to me. The adrenaline drained from my bloodstream in an instant. My knees buckled. I leaned my back against the freezing metal of the storage door, sliding slowly downward until I hit the rough pavement. I sat there in the dark shadows of the industrial park, gasping for air, the raw tissue in my throat burning in fierce protest. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and looked at the illuminated screen. 3:30 in the morning. In exactly 2.5 hours, a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck would back into my assigned space in the downtown parking garage. The driver would step out with his clipboard, expecting to hook up a pristine classic car. Instead, he would find nothing but a puddle of cold motor oil and empty space. I wiped a thin layer of cold sweat from my forehead. Despite the agonizing pain radiating through my chest, the corners of my mouth curled upward. I was smiling. I had just fired the first silent shot. I had dared the bank and my family to locate a ghost asset they no longer controlled. The momentum had shifted entirely, but shielding the asset meant I was no longer a passive victim. It meant I was actively fighting back. I knew Patricia and Liam would not accept this defeat quietly. The moment the bank notified them that the collateral was missing, they would panic. They would come looking for the vehicle, and they would use every manipulative tactic in their extensive arsenal to force me to surrender. I needed to ensure they looked in the wrong direction. The sunlight woke me. My phone was vibrating against the wooden nightstand, a relentless, angry rattle. The digital clock read 8:15 in the morning. The tow truck driver had arrived at my parking space over 2 hours ago. The collection agency had undoubtedly notified the bank, and the bank had immediately dialed the secondary contacts on the fraudulent loan application. I picked up the device. 47 missed calls, 32 text messages. The notifications were a cascading wall of panic. Liam had sent the majority of them. His texts started with confusion, then pivoted to frantic demands, and finally spiraled into overt threats. "Where is the car? The bank says the space is empty. Call me back right now." Patricia was more restrained, yet her words carried a sharper edge. "George, stop playing games. You are making your brother look bad. Call me." I did not call them back. I walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat at the island. I let them sweat for 3 hours. The psychology of a trap requires the prey to believe they are running out of options. If I answered immediately, they would retain their sense of authority. By forcing them to wait, I allowed their anxiety to hollow out their confidence. At noon, I typed a single reply to a group thread. "I brought the vehicle to a secure mechanic last night. Come to my apartment. We need to talk." They arrived 20 minutes later. The knock on my front door was loud, erratic, and heavy. I did not rush to answer. I made sure to walk slowly, amplifying the residual stiffness from my hospital stay. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. Liam stood in the hallway, his face flushed red beneath the collar of his designer polo shirt. He was sweating despite the cool autumn air. Patricia stood half a step behind him, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. Liam pushed past me before I could even step aside. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, pacing across my living room rug. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you just caused? The bank manager called me at breakfast. They think we are hiding the collateral." I closed the door and turned to face them. I kept my shoulders slumped, letting my chin drop just a fraction. "I need to protect my assets, Liam," I said, my voice low and intentionally unsteady. "You missed the first payment. They were going to take my property." Patricia stepped forward. Her expensive leather handbag swung against her hip. "You are being selfish, George," she said, her tone dripping with rehearsed disappointment. "Your brother is facing a temporary cash flow issue. The supply chain is disrupted. We needed that vehicle sitting right where the bank expected it to be. You are jeopardizing everything over a piece of metal." I looked at Liam. My older brother had never possessed the discipline to build anything sustainable. Every business venture he launched was funded by our parents and propped up by their endless safety nets. He drove luxury sedans, wore imported watches, and lived in a sprawling subdivision house, all while his corporate ledgers bled crimson ink. Meanwhile, I had spent years grinding through forensic accounting audits to purchase this modest downtown condo with my own clean capital. To Liam, my hard work was simply a reservoir he felt entitled to drain. "Where is the car?" Liam demanded, stopping his pacing to glare at me. "Give me the keys and the location. I will drive it back to the garage myself." The bank gave me until 5 o'clock to produce the vehicle, or they are calling the entire loan due. This was the moment, the hinge upon which my entire strategy rested. If I defied them directly, they would escalate. They would hire private investigators, freeze my personal accounts through legal harassment, and turn the entire extended family against me. I needed time, and the only way to buy time was to feed them a lie they desperately wanted to swallow. I let out a long, ragged sigh. I looked down at the floorboards, portraying a man who had finally cracked under the pressure. "I am sorry," I whispered. The room went completely still. Liam blinked, the anger faltering on his face. I panicked. I continued keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Waking up in that hospital bed, seeing the lean, I just panicked. I love that car. I spent 4 years rebuilding that engine. The thought of a repo agent towing it away just broke me. I moved it to a friend's warehouse outside the city limits because I was scared. Patricia softened her stance. A triumphant gleam flickered in her eyes. She thought the rebellion had been crushed. "George," she said smoothly, using the maternal cadence she deployed when she was winning, "we understand you were startled, but you must see the bigger picture. We are family." I looked up, meeting her gaze with practiced submission. "I know," I said, "and you are right. Family helps family. But giving the bank the car does not actually solve Liam's problem. It only covers a fraction of the debt, and he will still be in default." Liam crossed his arms. "Then what are you suggesting?" I took a slow breath. "I will list this apartment for sale." The silence returned thicker this time. I watched their minds process the offer. The downtown real estate market was booming. My condo possessed a significant amount of equity. "I can call a realtor tomorrow morning," I said, my voice steady and compliant. "If we price it for a quick sale, I can liquidate the equity in 30 days. That will generate enough pure cash to pay down the principal of your loan directly. It clears the default, and it gets the bank off your back permanently. In exchange, I get to keep the car." Patricia let out a sudden breathy laugh. She literally clapped her hands together, the gold bracelets on her wrists clinking sharply in the quiet room. The sickeningly sweet relief washed over her face. She had her scapegoat back, properly aligned, and eager to sacrifice his own shelter to protect her favorite child. "George, that is a wonderful idea," Patricia said, stepping forward to squeeze my forearm. "That is incredibly mature of you. See, Liam? I told you your brother would come through for us." Liam exhaled a loud gust of air, the tension leaving his shoulders. He walked over and clapped a heavy hand onto my back. "I knew you would understand, man," he said, flashing a bright, patronizing smile. "It is just a temporary rough patch. You sell the place, bail me out, and I will pay you back with interest once the logistics contracts clear next quarter." We both knew he would never pay me a dime, but I nodded anyway. "Just tell the bank manager we are restructuring the debt with a real estate sale," I told them. "Ask for a 45-day forbearance. They will grant it if they see a listing agreement." Patricia nodded eagerly. "I will call them right now. This is perfect." They did not stay for coffee. They had extracted exactly what they came for, or so they believed. They walked out of my apartment victorious, celebrating their successful manipulation of the younger, weaker sibling. The heavy front door clicked shut behind them. I stood in the center of the living room. The pathetic, submissive posture melted from my frame. My spine straightened. I walked over to the deadbolt and turned the lock. I had zero intention of listing my home. I was never going to call a realtor, and I was certainly never going to pay down Liam's fraudulent debt. What I had just purchased was a 45-day window of absolute silence. They would stop looking for the Mustang. They would stop calling me. They would sit back and wait for a check that was never going to arrive. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I pressed the power button on my encrypted tower server. The cooling fans whirred to life, a low, steady hum in the quiet room. My monitors illuminated, casting a cold blue glow across my face. I needed to understand the mechanics of how Patricia managed to authorize the loan while I was unconscious in the intensive care unit. A forged signature was useless without a licensed state official willing to verify it. I logged into the state corporate registry and pulled the raw public filings for Liam's limited liability company. I navigated through the dense pages of the commercial lien agreement until I reached the final authorization page. There, pressed onto the bottom right corner of the document, was a digital scan of a circular ink stamp. A public notary had certified my presence. The seal belonged to a woman named Brenda. She was a local real estate agent and a close associate of my mother. Brenda had placed her professional license and her freedom on a document claiming I was standing in her office, signing a contract at the exact minute a surgeon was inserting a breathing tube down my throat. I stared at Brenda's name on the screen. Patricia thought she was safe. She had no idea I had just isolated the weakest link in her entire fraudulent chain. I printed the documents on heavy bond paper. The physical heft of a document changes how a person reacts to it. Flimsy printer paper suggests a draft, something negotiable. Thick, textured paper implies finality. It carries the weight of a court order. I placed the Uniform Commercial Code filing on the left side of my leather portfolio and my certified medical charts on the right. Brenda ran a boutique property agency in Carmel, a wealthy suburb north of Indianapolis, known for manicured lawns and aggressive homeowners associations. She and my mother had shared the same tennis instructor for a decade. Brenda was the kind of woman who built her entire identity on local prestige. She hosted charity galas, sponsored youth soccer teams, and plastered her face on the side of city buses. A felony charge would not just ruin her business, it would annihilate her social existence. I parked my vehicle 2 blocks away from her storefront. Walking the remaining distance tested my healing lungs, but I needed to arrive unannounced, and I could not risk her recognizing my car through her front window. The bell above the glass door chimed a cheerful melodic note as I stepped inside. The office smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers and fresh printer toner. Brenda was sitting behind a pristine mahogany desk, typing rapidly on a silver laptop. When she looked up and recognized me, her initial shock was quickly buried beneath a thick layer of practiced real estate charm. Patricia had obviously spread the good news about my fake surrender. Brenda thought she knew exactly why I was standing in her lobby. "George, honey, it is so wonderful to see you on your feet," Brenda said, standing up and smoothing her tailored skirt. "Your mother called me yesterday. She said you were finally ready to list your downtown condo. I have some amazing comps we can look at right now. The market is exceptionally hot this week." I did not smile. I did not return her greeting. I walked slowly toward her desk, pulled out the single guest chair, and sat down. My chest ached with a dull, persistent throb, but my hands were entirely steady. I unzipped the leather portfolio and withdrew the heavy pages. "I am not here to list my property, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "I am here to discuss your state notary commission." The bright, eager expression vanished from her face. She slowly sat back down in her leather executive chair. "What do you mean, George?" I placed the first document on the polished wood between us. It was the commercial pledge authorization. I pointed my index finger at the bottom right corner of the page. Right there, resting above the signature line, was the blue ink imprint of her official Indiana notary seal. It displayed her full legal name, her commission number, and the expiration date of her license. "That is your stamp," I said. "It certifies that I, George Ember, physically stood in your presence, presented valid government identification, and signed this financial contract." Brenda swallowed hard. Her eyes darted toward the front window, checking to see if anyone was walking past the agency. She let out a nervous, breathy laugh. "Well, yes, your mother brought the paperwork by. She said you had agreed to everything over the phone, but were just too sick to drive up here to sign it yourself." "She is my oldest friend, George. I was just doing a favor to help your family get through a tough week." I watched her rationalize a crime. She truly believed that social proximity insulated her from the law. I placed the second document next to the first. It was the surgical flow sheet from the Indianapolis General Intensive Care Unit. The pages were dense with medical codes, medication dosages, and physician signatures. I pulled a red pen from my jacket pocket and circled a specific row of data near the center of the page. "I want you to look at the timestamp next to your notary seal," I told her. "You stamped that commercial pledge at 2:15 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Now, I want you to look at the medical chart." Brenda leaned forward reluctantly. Her eyes traced the red circle I had drawn. At 2:14 that afternoon, my anesthesiologist administered a heavy dose of propofol. I explained, keeping my tone entirely clinical. "At 2:15, the exact minute you legally certified, I was standing in this room. A trauma surgeon was inserting a plastic breathing tube down my trachea. I was unconscious, Brenda. I was fighting respiratory failure." The silence in the office turned heavy and suffocating. The air conditioning kicked on, humming loudly in the background. Brenda stared at the medical chart. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. "A commercial bank loan crosses state lines," I continued softly. "That elevates the transaction from a state issue to a federal matter. Falsifying a notary seal on a $74,000 commercial debt is wire fraud. It is conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The federal sentencing guidelines for those offenses carry a minimum of 5 years in a penitentiary. That is before the state of Indiana permanently revokes your real estate license and seizes your business assets to pay the civil penalties." She pressed her hands flat against the mahogany desk. Her fingers were trembling so severely, her diamond rings rattled against the wood. "George, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I did not know. Patricia told me it was just a formality. She said you knew all about it." "My mother lied to you," I replied. "And because you decided to prioritize a country club friendship over your legal duty, you are currently holding the bag for a federal felony. When the bank audits this loan, and they will audit it very soon, you will be the first person indicted. My mother will claim she merely handed you the paper and you acted alone. She will let you go to prison to protect yourself." Tears welled in Brenda's eyes, spilling over her lower lashes and ruining her carefully applied makeup. A soft, pathetic sob escaped her throat. "I have 2 daughters in college," she gasped. "I cannot lose my license. I cannot go to jail, George. Tell me what you want, please. I will do anything." I reached into the back pocket of my portfolio. I had anticipated her exact psychological collapse. I withdrew a 3rd document. It was a pre-drafted sworn affidavit. The text plainly stated that Patricia Ember had brought the unsigned commercial pledge into the office, falsely claimed she had my permission, and coerced Brenda into stamping the document without the signatory present. "Sign this," I instructed. She grabbed her pen, her hand shaking violently, and scribbled her name across the bottom line. "Now," I said, leaning back in my chair, "call your assistant in here to witness and notarize your confession. You cannot notarize your own signature." Brenda let out another sob, the ultimate humiliation landing squarely on her shoulders. She reached for her desk phone and pressed the intercom button. Her assistant, a young woman in her 20s, walked into the office holding a clipboard. The assistant stopped in her tracks, staring at her boss, who was weeping openly over the mahogany desk. "Notarize this," Brenda choked out, pushing the paper toward the young woman. "Do not read it, just stamp it." The assistant quickly applied her seal, signed the witness line, and hurried out of the room, casting a terrified backward glance. I picked up the completed affidavit and slid it back into my leather portfolio. I zipped the case shut. Brenda had just handed me the ultimate legal weapon. I had surgically isolated my mother from her only institutional shield. Patricia thought she possessed an airtight contract. She had no idea her accomplice had just surrendered the entire scheme to save her own skin. I stood up from the guest chair. "You are going to keep smiling at my mother," I told the weeping woman. "You are going to play tennis with her on Thursday. If you warn her about this conversation, I will hand this envelope to the federal prosecutor before lunchtime." I walked out of the agency and stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The chime of the glass door sounded entirely different on the way out. It sounded like a vault locking shut. Sitting behind the steering wheel of my rental car, I rested the portfolio on the passenger seat. I had the forgery proof. I had the ghost vehicle. But as I mentally reviewed the puzzle pieces, a glaring inconsistency gnawed at my analytical mind. Liam was a terrible businessman, but his logistics company grossed enough revenue to cover minor operational deficits. $74,000 was a very specific, desperate number. It was not a calculated business investment. It was a ransom. Something deeper was buried in my brother's financial records. To find it, I needed access to his internal accounting ledgers. Under the guise of helping him restructure his debt for the upcoming condo sale, I would ask him for the files. I turned the ignition key, knowing the true motive for the theft was waiting to be uncovered. And it was going to be far worse than a failing shipping route. I steered the rental car back toward the city limits, the encrypted files waiting on my home server, pulling my focus forward. Upon returning to my downtown apartment, I placed a direct phone call to my brother. The digital clock on my desk read 4 in the afternoon. Liam answered on the second ring, the ambient noise of a busy restaurant echoing in the background. He sounded relaxed, riding the high of a man who believed he had just bullied his younger sibling into total submission. I kept my voice soft, maintaining the facade of a broken man trying to make amends. I told him the realtor was coming tomorrow to stage the condo. I also told him that if I was going to hand over the equity from my home, I needed to ensure the cash was deployed efficiently. I offered to perform a free forensic review of his corporate ledgers, promising to identify tax efficiencies that would maximize the impact of my sacrifice. Liam did not hesitate. His arrogance was a fatal vulnerability. To him, I was just a human calculator, a resource to be utilized without compensation. He scoffed at the idea that his books were anything less than perfect, but he eagerly agreed to the free labor. 10 minutes later, a secure file transfer protocol link arrived in my inbox. I downloaded the encrypted files, unpacked the archives, and imported the raw data into my analytical software. The digital architecture of a business is impossible to disguise from someone who knows where to look. Numbers lack the capacity to lie. They do not possess egos. They only reflect actions. I started with the injection of the $74,000. I located the exact timestamp of the deposit, mirroring the day I was admitted to the intensive care unit. The funds landed in the primary operating account of his logistics firm. According to the narrative Patricia had spun, the business was drowning due to supply chain disruptions and frozen vendor credit. If that were true, the fresh capital should have dispersed to cover past due invoices, fuel suppliers, vehicle maintenance, or warehouse leases. The money did none of those things. I watched the digital trail. The capital sat in the primary account for less than 12 hours. Then it began to fragment. $30,000 moved to a secondary holding account labeled as marketing expenditures. $40,000 transferred to a generic vendor categorized as international software licensing. The remaining $4,000 trickled into a petty cash reserve. I adjusted my monitor, leaning closer to the screen. The financial behavior was entirely erratic for a freight and shipping operation. I isolated the secondary holding accounts and initiated a trace on the outgoing wire transfers. The funds did not route to domestic vendors or legitimate logistics partners. The $30,000 moved through a payment processor in Cyprus. The $40,000 crossed the Atlantic, landing in a banking institution headquartered in Curacao. I expanded the search parameters, running a historical audit on the preceding 18 months of corporate activity. A chilling, rhythmic pattern emerged from the chaos. Every Tuesday and Friday, vast sums of capital vanished from the company ledgers, disguised under vague expense categories. Consulting fees, administrative overhead, technology acquisitions, all of them routing through the same foreign payment gateways. I pulled the receiving routing numbers and cross-referenced them with international financial watch lists. The results populated on my screen in a matter of seconds. The institutions in Cyprus and Curacao were not software developers or marketing firms. They were offshore, unregulated digital casinos and high-stakes sports betting syndicates. My brother was not running a struggling logistics company. He was operating a hollow shell, bleeding corporate revenue to feed a severe offshore gambling addiction. But the puzzle was incomplete. Liam lacked the technical sophistication to navigate encrypted foreign payment gateways or mask deposits using proxy servers. His vice was outward projection. He bought imported suits and leased luxury sedans to ensure everyone knew he possessed money. Hiding in the digital shadows was not his style. I shifted my focus to the user access logs on the corporate banking portal. Every transaction leaves a digital fingerprint, an IP address tracking the origin of the login. The requests initiating the offshore wires did not originate from the downtown office. They originated from the residential subdivision in the suburbs. Specifically, they triggered from a mobile device registered to his wife, Sarah. I sat back in my chair, the cold truth settling over the room like a heavy winter fog. Sarah grew up adjacent to wealth, always hovering on the periphery of the country club set, without truly belonging to it. When she married Liam, she assumed she was stepping into an endless reservoir of capital. When the reality of his mediocre business acumen became apparent, she sought the rush of high society elsewhere. She found it at the digital baccarat tables and international sports books, chasing dopamine hits across foreign servers. The pieces interlocked with devastating precision. Sarah had incinerated the company operating capital. When the vendors started calling and the accounts ran dry, Liam discovered the theft. Instead of holding his wife accountable or filing for bankruptcy, he chose to cover her tracks. He chose to commit federal bank fraud. He embezzled from his own corporate structure, and when the walls closed in, he went to Patricia for a bailout. Patricia, driven by an unyielding need to protect her golden child from public disgrace and federal prison, decided my life was an acceptable price to pay for their salvation. They forged my signature, risked my financial ruin, and stripped my assets while I lay suffocated by a ventilator, all to pay off a shadow casino debt. The $74,000 evaporated into the ether within 48 hours of the loan approval. My hands rested on the edge of the desk. The lingering physical pain in my chest was eclipsed by a cold, sharpened resolve. I was no longer merely fighting a bad commercial loan or a selfish sibling rivalry. I was dealing with a criminal syndicate masquerading as a family. I initiated a bulk download, pulling every single ledger IP log and wire transfer receipt from the server. I compiled the data into a sealed, encrypted folder on my physical hard drive. I held the definitive proof of fraudulent conveyance and corporate embezzlement. This was not a minor accounting error. It was the detonator to their entire marriage, their social standing, and their legal freedom. I closed the software applications. The trap was armed. I possessed the evidence required to dismantle their lives, but launching the assault right now would leave one critical vulnerability exposed. My vehicle was secure in the anonymous storage unit, shielding half of the collateral. The second half of the fraudulent pledge was still missing. My grandmother's vintage rings. Patricia claimed she pledged the jewelry to the bank. My forensic audit of the commercial loan documentation revealed a glaring logistical contradiction. Traditional commercial banks require extensive in-person physical appraisals to collateralize vintage gems. They do not accept a signature and a promise. They take physical custody of the assets. My mother had orchestrated this entire scheme in a matter of hours. The timeline did not fit the bureaucratic reality of institutional banking. She did not give the heirlooms to the bank. She gave them to someone else, someone who operated outside the boundaries of normal compliance, someone who provided fast, untraceable liquidity in exchange for holding priceless leverage. I needed to find the diamonds before a shadow lender melted them down, and I only had a few hours to figure out where she fenced them. The glaring inconsistency in the commercial loan paperwork kept my eyes pinned to the monitor. Institutional banks operate on rigid schedules. If you pledge vintage jewelry as collateral, the underwriting department demands physical custody. They require an independent gemologist to verify the cut, clarity, and carat weight before they issue a single dollar of credit. That bureaucratic process takes a minimum of 2 weeks. Patricia had executed this entire financial maneuver while I was suffocating on a ventilator. The timeline was mathematically impossible. I opened a new search window and pulled my mother's personal banking records. I still had the login credentials from when I helped her structure her retirement accounts years ago. I scanned the deposits leading up to the creation of Liam's fraudulent commercial loan. The narrative began to unravel. The commercial bank had indeed accepted the lien on my Mustang, but they had not taken the rings. Instead, I found a wire transfer for $20,000 deposited into Patricia's account, originating from an entity registered as Zenith Capital Holdings. She had used that quick cash infusion to pay down Liam's most immediate vendor threats, creating the illusion of business stability required to secure the larger $74,000 bank loan. Zenith Capital Holdings was not a bank. I ran the corporate registration through the state database. It was a hard money bridge lender, a predatory firm operating out of a strip mall on the south side of the city. They specialized in high-interest, short-term cash advances secured by physical assets. They catered to desperate people who needed untraceable liquidity by yesterday. Patricia had walked into my bank, used her forged power of attorney to empty my safe deposit box, and carried my grandmother's heirloom diamonds into a pawn shop in a tailored suit. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Bridge lenders do not possess patience. Their business model relies on the borrower defaulting. When a payment is missed, they do not send polite letters. They liquidate the collateral immediately. I checked the date of the Zenith Capital transaction. It was structured as a 30-day term. Liam had just defaulted on his primary bank loan, which meant he had certainly defaulted on this secondary shadow debt. I accessed the Zenith Capital terms of service buried in their public corporate filings. The liquidation clause was explicit. Upon default, physical assets were routed to an independent jeweler to be melted down for the gold weight, and the raw stones were fenced through wholesale brokers. The contractual grace period was 72 hours. The clock was already ticking. By Friday afternoon, the rings my grandfather had carried across the ocean in his pocket would be reduced to untraceable loose gems. I could not rely on the legal system. Filing a police report for stolen property or requesting a court injunction would take weeks. A judge would require hearings, evidence, and testimonies. By the time a deputy arrived at the strip mall with a warrant, the diamonds would be gone. I had to bypass the law and utilize leverage. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting Zenith Capital Holdings. I dug through their property acquisitions, their subsidiary limited liability companies, and their public tax filings. Predatory lenders often operate on the fringes of financial compliance, assuming their desperate clientele will never possess the resources to audit them. I was not a desperate client. I was a forensic accountant with a vendetta. The vulnerabilities appeared quickly. Zenith Capital was executing dozens of cash transactions exceeding $10,000, but they were routinely failing to file the required Form 8300 with the Internal Revenue Service. They were artificially deflating their taxable income by shifting the default profits into shell companies registered in Nevada. It was a classic sloppy tax evasion structure. They were effectively laundering their own predatory gains. I compiled the transaction logs, the unfiled tax forms, and the shell company ownership records. I printed the dossier, placed it into a fresh manila envelope, and grabbed my keys. The drive to the south side tested my endurance. My chest still radiated a dull, constant ache, but the adrenaline masked the worst of the fatigue. Zenith Capital Holdings was located between a discount liquor store and a vacant laundromat. The windows were tinted black. A glowing neon sign buzzed in the corner, offering instant cash approvals. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The interior smelled of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. There was no welcoming receptionist. A thick sheet of bulletproof acrylic separated the waiting area from a back office. A man with thinning gray hair and a thick neck sat behind the glass, staring at a computer monitor. He wore a cheap dress shirt that strained across his chest. I walked up to the transaction slot. "I need to speak with the owner," I said. The man did not look up from his screen. "Read the sign, buddy. Applications are processed online. We do not do walk-in consultations." I slid the manila envelope through the narrow gap beneath the acrylic. "I am not here for a loan, Marcus," I said, reading his name off the framed business license hanging on the back wall. "I am here to discuss your federal tax liabilities." Marcus stopped typing. He looked at the envelope, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. He carried the weary, hardened expression of a man accustomed to dealing with desperate addicts and angry gamblers. He picked up the envelope, unclasped the metal tab, and slid the documents onto his desk. I watched his eyes scan the first page. The bored indifference vanished, replaced by a rigid, guarded tension. He flipped to the second page, then the third. He was looking at a precise roadmap of his illegal corporate structuring. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, threatening gravel. "I am the legal owner of the vintage diamond rings Patricia Ember brought into this office 4 weeks ago," I replied. My voice remained entirely flat, betraying zero emotion. "She utilized a forged signature to access my safe deposit box. You issued her a $20,000 cash advance against stolen property." Marcus leaned forward, pressing his hands against the desk. "Listen to me very carefully. I have a signed contract. I possess a copy of a power of attorney. If you have a dispute with your mother, you take it to civil court. If you come into my business threatening me, I will have you removed." I did not blink. I leaned closer to the acrylic divider. "The power of attorney was forged while I was in a hospital bed," I said. "I possess the sworn, notarized confession of the accomplice who stamped it, which means you are currently in possession of stolen property. However, I am not interested in calling the police. Law enforcement is tedious. I am interested in the Nevada shell companies you use to wash your default liquidations. I tapped the glass right where his face hovered on the other side. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about my stolen rings, but they care deeply about unreported cash transactions and structured tax evasion. The fines for failing to file those cash reports will exceed $500,000. The federal prison sentence for money laundering will take up the next decade of your life. Marcus stared at me. The silence stretched between us, thick with calculated risk. He was a predator, but he was also a businessman. He was currently weighing the $20,000 profit from fencing my grandmother's diamonds against the catastrophic destruction of his entire lending empire. I am giving you a very simple choice, Marcus, I said softly. You can place the velvet pouch containing my family heirlooms into that transaction slot right now. If you do, I will walk out of this door and I will delete the digital files detailing your tax evasion. If you refuse, I will drive directly to the federal building downtown and hand this dossier to an agent in the Financial Crimes Division. He did not yell. He did not posture. He simply stared into my eyes, searching for a bluff. He found nothing but cold certainty. I had survived a respiratory tube. A pawnshop operator in a strip mall was not going to intimidate me. Marcus slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up, walked over to a heavy steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the office, and spun the dial. The heavy tumblers clicked into place. He pulled the door open, reached into a metal lockbox, and withdrew a faded black velvet pouch. He walked back to the acrylic divider and pushed the pouch through the narrow slot. You and your family are permanently banned from this establishment, he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. If you ever walk through that door again, we will have a very different conversation. I picked up the pouch. The familiar weight of the heavy gold bands and raw diamonds settled into my palm. I unfastened the drawstring and verified the contents. The rings were untouched. My grandfather's legacy was secure. I slipped the pouch into my jacket pocket. Keep the folder, Marcus, I said, turning toward the exit. Consider it a free audit. I walked out of the shadow lender's office and stepped back into the sunlight. The air tasted remarkably clean. I had physically secured the Mustang. I had isolated the corrupt notary. I had recovered the stolen heirlooms. The defensive phase of my strategy was officially complete. My family had stripped my life for parts, assuming I would remain a silent, compliant victim. I had taken back everything that belonged to me. Now the battlefield was clear. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the velvet pouch, and I smiled. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to send Liam's encrypted offshore casino ledgers to the federal tax board and watch the golden child's false empire burn to the ground. I returned to the sanctuary of my downtown apartment and placed the faded velvet pouch into a fireproof floor safe hidden beneath the carpet of my office. The dull clink of the heavy rings settling against the steel felt like a period at the end of a long and difficult sentence. The heirloom diamonds were secure. My vintage car sat untouched in a ghost unit. I had spent the last 3 weeks building walls to protect myself from the people who shared my bloodline. Now the defensive posture ended. I sat at my desk and woke my encrypted server. The screen illuminated my face, reflecting the raw data of my older brother's financial sins. I opened the federal portal for the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. Filing a Form 211 requires meticulous precision. You cannot merely allege wrongdoing. You must provide a map. I provided a surgical schematic. I attached the digital ledgers highlighting the precise routing numbers in Cyprus and Curacao. I outlined the dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the matching internet protocol addresses, tracing directly to Sarah's mobile device in the suburbs. I categorized the crime as structured corporate embezzlement, designed to mask illicit offshore gambling debts, creating a severe tax liability. The federal government possesses an infinite capacity for patience when dealing with domestic errors. However, when an algorithm detects untaxed capital fleeing across international borders into unregulated casinos, their patience vanishes. I reviewed the summary narrative one final time, ensuring my identity remained masked behind a secure proxy network. I clicked the submission button. The loading wheel spun for 2 seconds before a green confirmation banner appeared. The digital package was in the hands of the Treasury Department. I powered down the monitor, stood up, and went to the kitchen to brew a pot of tea. 3 days passed. I utilized the quiet hours to focus on my physical rehabilitation. I walked the length of the Indianapolis Canal Walk, forcing my healing lungs to expand in the crisp autumn air. Each step brought a renewed sense of stamina. I was shedding the lingering weakness of the hospital bed. While I walked, I imagined the invisible bureaucratic machinery grinding into motion inside a federal building. A Treasury agent would review my dossier, verify the foreign wire transfers, and immediately hit a red button. The government does not mail a polite warning letter to a suspected flight risk. They bypass the citizen entirely and send direct regulatory freeze orders to the clearinghouses. Thursday evening brought the storm. The sky outside my window had turned a deep, bruised purple when the doorbell rang. It was not a polite knock. It was a rapid, frantic hammering against the wood. I checked the peephole. Liam stood in the hallway. He looked nothing like the arrogant, polished executive who had patronized me earlier in the week. His expensive, tailored shirt was wrinkled and clinging to his chest with sweat. His hair stood up at odd angles, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, chalky gray. His eyes were wide and darting, filled with the primal terror of a trapped animal. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. "George," he gasped, pushing his way into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He paced in a tight circle, his breathing ragged and uneven. "My cards are declining. Every single piece of plastic I own." I closed the door, maintaining a calm, neutral expression. "What do you mean, Liam? Did you overdraw the operating account?" He stopped pacing and looked at me, his hands shaking. "It is not an overdraft. I went to the bank branch an hour ago to pull cash for payroll. The teller looked at her screen, turned white, and told me she could not process any transactions. She handed me a slip of paper with a toll-free number for the Department of the Treasury. They locked everything, George. The corporate accounts, my personal checking, even Sarah's debit cards. The money is frozen." I guided him toward the kitchen island and handed him a glass of water. He gripped the glass with both hands, the water sloshing over the rim as he lifted it to his mouth. The supreme dramatic irony of the moment tasted sweeter than any victory I had ever engineered. The man who had forged my signature while I was dying. The man who had stolen my grandmother's legacy to cover his wife's gambling losses was now standing in my kitchen, begging me for salvation. He had no idea he was asking his executioner for a pardon. I leaned against the counter, furrowing my brow in a flawless display of brotherly concern. "Liam, the federal government only initiates a blanket asset freeze if they suspect severe financial misconduct. Have you been moving capital overseas without declaring it?" He swallowed hard, his eyes shifting toward the floor. He possessed a lifelong habit of blaming external factors for his own mistakes. If a business failed, it was a bad market. If a vendor sued him, it was a misunderstanding. He could not accept accountability even when the walls were crushing him. "No," he stammered, lying directly to my face. "Just some international software licenses. It is standard logistics software. Someone must have reported me, George. A jealous competitor, a disgruntled vendor. You know how these federal auditors work. They strike first and ask questions later." I reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm. "This is serious," I told him, matching his urgency with a measured, professional gravity. "But you came to the right place. I know how to navigate a Treasury audit. I will log into your encrypted servers tonight. I will trace the routing logs and find out exactly what triggered this flag. We will find the leak, Liam. I promise you." The relief that washed over his face was pathetic. He let out a long, shaky breath, the tension leaving his posture. "Thank you," he whispered. "I knew I could count on you. You always know how to fix the numbers." He set the empty glass on the granite counter and turned toward the door. He walked out of my apartment, carrying a false sense of hope, genuinely believing his brilliant younger sibling was going to unravel the federal knot and save his hollow empire. The moment the deadbolt clicked into place, the mask of the supportive brother dissolved. I did not walk to my desk to save him. I walked to my desk to bury him. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to the commercial lending portal of the bank holding the $74,000 fraudulent note. Financial institutions employ automated risk mitigation algorithms to protect their capital. If a borrower loses access to their primary operating accounts, the risk of default skyrockets. A commercial lender will never wait for a federal tax investigation to conclude. They secure their position instantly. I utilized the bank's anonymous compliance tip line. I submitted a brief, precise notification linking Liam's limited liability company to an active Department of Treasury asset freeze. I included the routing numbers of his locked accounts as verification. The logic of American institutional banking is cold and ruthless. The moment the bank's compliance officer verified the federal freeze, they would push a single button. They would upgrade Liam's bridge loan to critical default status. The 45-day forbearance they granted when I pretended to sell my condo was now void. The entire $74,000 principal was due immediately. I leaned back in my chair watching the screen power down. The bank was about to launch a full-scale collection assault. They would send their repo agents to collect the Mustang, only to find an empty parking space and a legal firewall. They would demand the vintage rings, but Zenith Capital Holdings had already surrendered them to me. The primary collateral was gone. The bank was holding a worthless contract, a frozen debtor, and a severe deficit. They would have no choice but to pivot. They would open the underwriting file and locate the only remaining asset capable of satisfying the debt, the secondary guarantor. They would aim their sights directly at the sprawling suburban house my mother cherished more than her own son. The snare was pulling tight. The morning rain washed down the large windows of my downtown apartment. I sat in the dim light of my home office, watching the water trace unpredictable paths across the glass. The commercial lender was currently waking up to the reality of my anonymous tip. Liam possessed zero operating capital. His accounts were frozen by a federal tax audit. A hard default was no longer a distant possibility. It was an immediate reality. The bank would inevitably deploy their recovery agents to seize the listed collateral. I had already shielded the vintage car behind a corporate trust and recovered the heirloom diamonds from the shadow lender. The primary assets were ghosts. But a lingering question remained in my analytical mind. Commercial banking institutions despise risk. They operate on strict mathematical formulas. When a high-risk client like Liam requests $74,000 for a failing enterprise, the underwriting department demands a minimum of 120% collateral coverage. They factor in depreciation liquidation costs and market volatility. My restored vehicle and the vintage rings possessed significant value, but even at peak appraisal, they fell short of the threshold required to greenlight the loan. The math did not balance. The bank required a backstop. They needed a secondary guarantor. I turned away from the window and focused on the glowing monitor. I opened a secure connection to the county property recorder database. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed the familiar street name and house number of my childhood home. Patricia resided in a sprawling brick colonial in the northern suburbs. She purchased the property shortly after my father passed away. It was not merely a shelter for her. It was the physical manifestation of her social standing. The house featured 4 bedrooms, a grand foyer, and immaculate landscaping she used to host junior league garden parties. She spent her weekends polishing the hardwood floors and boasting to her neighbors about the neighborhood property values. She prized that suburban castle above anything else in her life. The search results populated on the screen. I scrolled past the original deed and the primary mortgage records. Near the bottom of the list, a new document was recorded. The date stamp matched the exact afternoon I was lying in the intensive care unit. It was a secondary deed of trust, a commercial cross-collateralization agreement linking the equity of her suburban home directly to the corporate debt of Liam's logistics firm. I leaned forward, reading the fine print of the legal filing. Patricia had leveraged her own sanctuary. She had placed the roof over her head on the line to act as the ultimate backstop for the golden child. Her blind devotion to Liam was so profound, she was willing to risk homelessness to protect his fragile ego. But she did not want to actually pay the price if he failed. The realization of her hypocrisy settled into my chest with the weight of cold iron. Patricia knew Liam was a terrible businessman. She knew the loan carried a high probability of default. She needed a buffer between her beloved house and the bank collection department. That buffer was me. She stole my vintage car and my grandmother's diamonds to serve as the frontline casualties. The banking contract was structured sequentially. If the logistics company missed a payment, the collection agents would seize the vehicle and melt the rings first. My life savings would absorb the initial shockwave. Her house would remain safe unless the final deficit exceeded the value of my stolen goods. She engineered a financial architecture where her youngest son took the bullet, allowing her favorite son to keep playing executive while she kept her pristine garden. It was a calculated, breathtaking betrayal. She did not merely abandon me in a hospital bed. She positioned my lifeless body as a sandbag to protect her own comfort. I did not feel sorrow. The profound clarity of the situation burned away any lingering familial guilt. I opened a blank legal template on my desktop. It was time to pull the structural pin. I began drafting a federal injunction. The document was designed to formally sever my name and my assets from the commercial pledge. I typed the legal framework required to contest the Uniform Commercial Code filing based on criminal forgery. I cited the specific state statutes regarding authorized signatures. Then I prepared the exhibit pages. Exhibit A was the sworn, notarized affidavit from Brenda. The real estate agent confessed in plain ink that Patricia coerced her into stamping the contract while I was absent. Exhibit B was the surgical flow sheet from the hospital, proving I was undergoing an invasive medical procedure at the exact minute the document was executed. The evidence was irrefutable. No judge or compliance officer could look at those pages and uphold the lien against my property. I printed the document. The heavy pages slid from the printer tray with a rhythmic, satisfying hum. I aligned the edges and punched holes along the margin, binding the injunction inside a rigid black legal folder. The mechanics of the trap were simple and devastating. The collection department of a commercial bank does not shrug and walk away when primary collateral is legally invalidated. The algorithm simply recalculates the deficit. The moment I presented this injunction, the bank would release their claim on my car and jewelry. The entire crushing weight of the $74,000 default would instantly shift. It would crash directly onto the secondary guarantor, Patricia. She built this financial prison to trap me, but she left the door wide open. I was about to step out and lock her inside. I placed the black folder into my leather briefcase. Sending the injunction through certified mail would take too long. Allowing the bank lawyers to process the paperwork behind closed doors would offer Patricia a chance to negotiate a quiet settlement. I needed to execute this maneuver with maximum impact. I needed to trap her in a public setting where her social defenses would shatter. The bank manager would undoubtedly call an emergency meeting the moment the federal tax freeze was verified. They would summon the primary borrower and the guarantors to the downtown branch to demand an explanation. Liam and Patricia would walk into that lobby, expecting to offer the manager my car and my rings as a peace offering. I checked my watch. The business day was just beginning. I would not wait for an invitation to that meeting. I would arrive unannounced. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door, eager to watch the liability shift, knowing my mother was about to feel the terrifying crosshairs of a ruthless collection division aimed squarely at her own front door. The downtown financial district stood sharp and gray against the overcast morning sky. I navigated my rental sedan into the subterranean parking garage beneath the regional headquarters of the commercial bank. Sitting in the passenger seat beside me was Harrison Cole. Harrison was a specialized corporate litigator. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, carried a leather briefcase, and billed $800 an hour. I did not hire him to argue my case. I hired him to serve as a silent, intimidating witness to the financial execution I was about to perform. We rode the polished steel elevator to the executive lending floor. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling lobby lined with imported marble and frosted glass partitions. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the environment at a crisp, calculated temperature, designed to keep clients awake and uneasy. I led the way down the central corridor toward the office of the senior commercial lending manager, a man named Sterling. The architectural design of the bank favored transparency. The offices featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls, an illusion of open honesty masking the ruthless arithmetic occurring inside. Through the glass panes of the corner office, I spotted them. Sterling sat behind a broad mahogany desk, his posture rigid, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Liam sat in one of the plush guest chairs, sweating straight through his tailored dress shirt. His leg bounced in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Patricia sat beside him, her spine perfectly straight, her designer handbag resting on her lap. She was attempting to project the serene confidence of a wealthy socialite handling a minor administrative error. They were holding an emergency meeting. The federal tax freeze I initiated had triggered internal alarms, pulling Liam into the bank to answer for his frozen operating capital. Patricia was undoubtedly sitting in that chair, trying to leverage my hidden vehicle and my vintage diamonds to pacify the manager. She believed she possessed the collateral required to buy her favorite son a pardon. I pushed the heavy glass door open. I did not knock. The conversation inside the room halted instantly. Liam flinched, his bouncing leg freezing in place. Sterling looked up, a frown forming across his stern, deeply lined face. He did not appreciate unannounced interruptions during critical delinquency meetings. Patricia recovered her composure first. Her survival instinct kicked in, urging her to control the narrative before I could speak. She stood up, forcing a bright, plastic smile onto her face. "George, thank goodness you are here," she said, her voice dripping with artificial relief. "Mr. Sterling and I were just discussing the logistical delay with your vehicle. Please tell the manager where you parked the Mustang so the recovery agents can finalize the transfer. We need to clear this paperwork today." She gestured toward an empty leather chair, inviting me to step into the designated role of the sacrificial lamb. I did not look at her. I stopped in the center of the room. Harrison stepped up to my right side, resting his briefcase on the edge of the mahogany desk. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice low and devoid of any emotional inflection. "My name is George Ember. I am the alleged secondary signatory on the $74,000 commercial note you hold for this logistics firm. The man standing beside me is my legal counsel, Harrison Cole." Sterling shifted his gaze from me to Harrison. The bank manager recognized the name of the law firm. The annoyance on his face evaporated, replaced by the cautious, guarded expression of a corporate officer sensing an impending lawsuit. "I am not here to surrender a vehicle," I continued. "I am here to notify this institution that you are currently attempting to execute collection actions upon a poisoned contract." Patricia let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It sounded brittle in the quiet office. "George, stop being dramatic. Mr. Sterling does not have time for your sibling rivalry." Harrison ignored her. He unlatched his briefcase with a sharp, metallic click. He withdrew the rigid black legal folder I had prepared the night before and slid it across the polished wood directly in front of the bank manager. "Open it," I instructed. Sterling flipped the heavy cover back. He stared at the summary brief outlining the federal injunction. I watched his eyes scan the first paragraph. The Uniform Commercial Code filing securing this debt was obtained through criminal forgery. I explained, the steady cadence of my voice filling the silent room. The signature on the pledge is false. Please turn to Exhibit A. Sterling turned the page. He was staring at the sworn, notarized affidavit from Brenda. The notary public who stamped that commercial pledge confessed to falsifying the presence of the signatory, I said. She swore, under penalty of perjury, that Patricia Ember coerced her into authenticating the document while I was absent. Liam shifted in his chair. He turned to look at his mother, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The color drained from her face. "Turn to Exhibit B," I told the manager. Sterling flipped the page again. He traced his index finger down the medical flow sheet from the Indianapolis General Intensive Care Unit. At the exact minute that notary stamp was pressed onto your commercial contract, I was strapped to a hospital bed, undergoing an invasive intubation procedure, I said. I was fighting respiratory failure. I could not hold a pen, let alone stand in a real estate office to authorize a corporate lien. Sterling stopped reading. He slowly pushed the black folder away from him. He treated the document as if it were a live explosive. A commercial lending manager dreads nothing more than federal compliance violations. Processing a loan secured by forged assets exposes the institution to severe penalties from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. It risks their banking charter. It triggers automatic internal audits and potential criminal investigations. Sterling realized in a fraction of a second that the collateral he thought secured his $74,000 deficit was a toxic liability. "The lien on my classic car is invalid," I stated smoothly. "The heirloom jewelry my mother pawned to a shadow lender has been recovered and secured. I have formally severed my name from this debt. If you dispatch a recovery agent to harass me regarding this invalid contract, Mr. Cole will file a civil suit against this branch for harassment and predatory lending practices before the close of business." Sterling leaned back in his leather executive chair. He folded his hands together. "We will place an immediate internal freeze on the disputed collateral," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "The legal department will review these affidavits. If they verify this timeline, the bank will formally release all claims against your property, Mr. Ember." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The protective wall Patricia had constructed around her favored child was crumbling into dust. She lunged out of her chair. She reached across the space between us, attempting to grab my forearm. "George, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. She was abandoning her socialite armor, resorting to raw, desperate manipulation. "You are destroying your brother over a misunderstanding. The money is gone. Liam will go to prison if the bank reports the default. Please, you have to help us." I took a slow step backward, ensuring her hands grabbed nothing but empty air. I looked at her, studying the terrified features of the woman who thought my life was an acceptable currency to spend. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I simply looked past her, directing my gaze back to the bank manager. "My assets were obtained through criminal fraud," I clarified softly. "Since the primary collateral is no longer legally viable, I believe your collection department needs to look at the secondary guarantor." Sterling slowly shifted his eyes away from me. He turned his gaze toward Patricia. The liability shifted in real time. The invisible weight of the $74,000 default transferred from my shoulders directly onto hers. Sterling opened a digital file on his computer monitor. "Mr. Ember is correct," he said, addressing my mother in a tone devoid of any customer service polish. "Your signature is listed on a secondary deed of trust. You utilized your residential property to cross-collateralize this corporate note. Patricia backed away from me. She sank slowly into her chair, her knees failing to support her weight. With the primary assets frozen by a fraud dispute and the corporate accounts locked by a federal tax audit, the bank requires an immediate avenue for recovery, Sterling continued. The entire principal balance is due. If you cannot produce a cashier check for $74,000 by 5 o'clock this evening, this institution will initiate foreclosure proceedings on your suburban home tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. The buffer was gone. Patricia realized her own home, her prized suburban castle, was now the sole target of an aggressive banking collection division. She had engineered a trap for me, and she was now sitting squarely on the trigger. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the glass office, Harrison Cole trailing quietly behind me. The heavy door swung shut, sealing them inside their own financial tomb. I walked across the marble lobby, anticipating the inevitable chaos. Without my assets to absorb the impact, Liam and Patricia would inevitably turn on each other. And when Liam went home to Sarah, the true implosion of his marriage would finally begin. The heavy autumn rain battered the large glass windows of my living room. An unrelenting storm had moved across Indianapolis during the late afternoon, turning the downtown streets into slick rivers of black asphalt and reflecting the harsh glare of the streetlights. I sat in the quiet comfort of my apartment, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the water against the glass. The ambient glow of a single floor lamp cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. My physical strength was slowly returning. The sharp, burning pain in my chest had faded into a dull, manageable ache. My hands no longer trembled when I held a cup of coffee. I was shedding the lingering ghosts of the intensive care unit, replacing the physical weakness with a cold, refined clarity. I thought about the sprawling brick colonial in the northern suburbs. Patricia had always equated adverse weather with social inconvenience. Rain was simply a nuisance that ruined her outdoor garden parties or delayed her weekly tennis matches at the country club. She possessed an extensive wardrobe specifically curated to avoid the elements, relying on heated garages and valet parking to maintain her pristine image. She built her entire identity around that suburban house. The manicured lawns, the grand foyer, the imported tile floors, they were not just architectural features, they constituted her armor. They provided the tangible proof of her superiority, allowing her to look down upon the rest of the world. She never allowed the harsh realities of life to touch her, unless she invited them inside. The heavy thud against my front door broke the peaceful silence of my apartment. It was not a polite, measured knock. It was a frantic, erratic hammering. The sound echoed down the short hallway, carrying the distinct rhythm of someone who had run out of options. I set my book on the coffee table and walked toward the entryway. I leaned forward and looked through the brass peephole. Patricia stood in the corridor. She looked nothing like the confident, polished socialite who had sat in the bank manager's office just hours earlier. She had been stripped of her armor. She was shivering uncontrollably. Her expensive designer trench coat was soaked through, clinging heavily to her narrow shoulders and dripping muddy water onto the corridor carpet. Her perfectly styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face. Her expensive makeup had run, leaving dark, bruised-looking streaks down her pale cheeks. The serene, superior mask she wore for the public had dissolved entirely, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She looked like a queen who had just watched her empire burn to the foundation. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door inward. The cold draft from the hallway swept into my warm apartment. Patricia practically lunged forward, but she stopped just short of crossing the threshold. "George, please," she gasped. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. "You have to let me in. You have to listen to me." I remained standing in the center of the doorway, using my body to block her path. I did not offer her a towel. I did not step aside to let her seek shelter from the biting chill. I merely looked at her, my expression devoid of any warmth or sympathy. She began to weep. The sound was ragged and unpolished, entirely lacking her usual theatrical grace. The bank sent an agent to the house. George, she sobbed, wrapping her wet arms around her own torso. They did not even wait for the morning. A man in a suit knocked on my door and handed me the preliminary foreclosure notice in front of my neighbors. They are giving me 48 hours to cure the default, or they are scheduling the public auction. I will lose everything, my home, my friends, my entire life. She reached out. Her wet, trembling hands grasped the fabric of my sweater. Her grip was desperate, digging into my arm. "You have to call the storage facility," she pleaded, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. "You have to release the classic car to the bank. If they take the Mustang and sell it, the capital lowers the deficit just enough to halt the immediate eviction process. It buys us time. Please, George, I am your mother. I raised you. You cannot stand there and let me become homeless over a piece of metal. You have to do the right thing for our family." I looked down at her hands clutching my sleeve. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. The emotional tether that once bound me to this woman had been permanently severed the moment I woke up, suffocating on a ventilator, and read her text message. The person standing in front of me was not a mother seeking comfort. She was a liability seeking another bailout. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away from her grip. She stumbled forward slightly as I removed her hold. "Wait here," I said softly. I turned my back on her and walked into my home office. I opened the top drawer of my wooden desk. Sitting on top of my financial files was a single sheet of heavy cardstock. I had printed it the day I returned from the hospital and sealed it in thick, clear laminate. It was the only physical token I kept from the intensive care unit. I picked it up and carried it back to the front door. Patricia looked up as I approached. Her eyes widened with a desperate, pathetic hope. She saw the document in my hand and genuinely believed I was returning with a signed release form or a set of keys. She believed her tears had successfully manipulated my conscience. I held the laminated card out to her. She took it with shaking hands. Her tear-filled eyes struggled to focus on the printed text in the dim light of the hallway. "Read it," I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. She stared at the words. Her lips began to tremble as the realization washed over her. The hope vanished from her expression, replaced by a hollow, sickening despair. I did not let her look away. I recited the text from memory, echoing the exact syllables she had typed while my lungs were failing and my life hung in the balance. "The bank had a deadline," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain hitting the windows behind me. "It is already done. Do not be angry. Family helps family." I watched the last spark of defiance extinguish in her eyes. She finally understood the magnitude of her miscalculation. I was not going to save her. I was forcing her to consume the exact poison she had poured down my throat. She had treated my survival as a transactional inconvenience, and now she was reaping the undeniable consequences of that transaction. "You made a choice," I said, the finality of the statement hanging heavy in the cold air. "You decided my life was an acceptable price to pay for Liam's mistakes. You stole my property and forged my name to protect your pristine suburban life. Now your house is the price. Pay it." She opened her mouth to speak, but only a broken, breathy sob escaped. Her knees buckled slightly, her posture collapsing inward under the crushing weight of her own ruin. I stepped back and pushed the heavy wooden door forward. It clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a solid, echoing thud. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of her crying on the other side of the wood. The psychological symmetry of the moment was flawless. Patricia was finally experiencing the suffocating, paralyzing helplessness she had inflicted upon me. She was trapped, isolated, and entirely stripped of her power. But the immense pressure destroying her world would not remain contained to my front porch. A crisis of this magnitude always seeks the path of least resistance. Liam was losing his primary safety net. His mother could no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. A desperate golden child with a frozen bank account and an impending federal audit would inevitably search for a new scapegoat. He would turn his panic inward. He would turn on the wife who caused his financial ruin, and the fragile foundation of their marriage was about to shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. The pale morning sun filtered through the rain-streaked glass of my windows, casting long, fractured shadows across my hardwood floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sharp, biting chill in the autumn air. I sat at my home office desk, a steaming cup of black coffee resting beside my keyboard. The encrypted server hummed a steady, quiet rhythm. I was monitoring a very specific digital tripwire, waiting for the inevitable panic to force my brother into a fatal error. Patricia had undoubtedly called Liam the moment she fled my apartment hallway. She would have delivered the terrifying news that the sacrificial buffer was gone. The commercial lender was no longer distracted by my classic car or my grandmother's diamonds. They were aiming their foreclosure division directly at her prized suburban estate. That meant Liam was entirely isolated. His corporate operating accounts remained locked by the Treasury Department. His personal credit cards were declining at the grocery store. He possessed zero liquid capital to pay his logistics vendors, secure a defense attorney, or maintain the illusion of his wealth. A desperate man with empty pockets will always attempt to liquidate his immediate surroundings. I knew exactly which asset he would target. I leaned forward as a bright red notification banner flashed across my primary monitor. The alert originated from the State Department of Motor Vehicles database. An external user had just requested a title verification check on a specific vehicle identification number. The number belonged to an imported luxury sports utility vehicle registered to Liam's wife. Sarah treated that vehicle as a rolling monument to her own entitlement. It featured custom-stitched leather interior, a panoramic glass roof, and vanity license plates. She drove it to her exclusive yoga studio and parked it prominently in front of the neighborhood clubhouse. The vehicle cost more than the down payment on my downtown condo. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of their hollow marriage, a gleaming shell financed by stolen capital and maintained by systemic fraud. Liam was currently attempting to sell his wife's prized possession to generate survival cash. He could not take the vehicle to a reputable franchise dealership. Traditional auto brokers required days to process underwriting and issue corporate checks. Liam needed untraceable paper currency before noon. He had driven the vehicle to a secondary wholesale automotive buyer on the industrial outskirts of the county. I pictured him standing in a dingy, fluorescent-lit office, sweating through his shirt, offering to surrender the title for half of its actual market value. He believed he was executing a clever, clandestine maneuver. He had no idea I had already barricaded that exit. When I submitted the whistleblower dossier to the Internal Revenue Service, I included a comprehensive schedule of assets purchased with the embezzled offshore casino funds. The luxury vehicle was prominently listed. To prevent the targets from liquidating the evidence, I filed a quiet notice of interest against the title. The wholesale auto broker was currently staring at his computer screen, watching a severe federal warning flag populate across the vehicle registry. The prompt indicated the asset was under active investigation by the Department of the Treasury for structured tax evasion and money laundering. A shady cash buyer might overlook a missed payment or a parking ticket. They will never touch an asset flagged by federal tax auditors. The broker was undoubtedly handing the keys back to my brother and ordering him off the asphalt lot to avoid institutional scrutiny. My mobile phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed Sarah's name. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to stretch before I tapped the screen and accepted the call. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply listened. The audio transmitting through the speaker was a chaotic symphony of domestic destruction. I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a glass vase shattering against a hardwood floor. Sarah was screaming. Her voice was stripped of its usual measured socialite perfection. It was a raw, guttural shriek, vibrating with pure terror. Liam was shouting in the background, his voice frantic and defensive. "Put the phone down, Sarah. Do not talk to him. I can fix this. Just give me an hour to call a lawyer." "You cannot fix anything, you pathetic liar," Sarah screamed back at him, the audio peaking into a distorted hiss. "You told me the money was clean. You told me your idiot brother took the fall for the bank loan." I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The facade had shattered. Liam had called her from the dealership lot in a blind panic, forced to confess that the vehicle was unsellable. He had to explain the federal block on the title, which meant he had to confess that the tax audit was not a random glitch affecting his logistics software. The federal government was looking directly at her offshore casino accounts. "George," Sarah yelled into the receiver, her breath hitching with a ragged sob. "Tell me what you did. The bank just declined my debit card at the pharmacy. Liam is telling me the feds flagged my car. What did you tell them?" I kept my voice icy, precise, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "I did not tell them anything that was not already written in your own digital ledgers, Sarah. I simply provided the Treasury Department with a map of your foreign wire transfers." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the line, broken only by the sound of Liam pleading in the background. "You wired $74,000 of stolen corporate capital to unregulated sportsbooks in Cyprus and Curacao," I explained, articulating each syllable with surgical clarity. "You used embezzled funds to finance your lifestyle and your luxury vehicle. The legal term is fraudulent conveyance. The federal auditors are tracing the capital flight right now." "No," Sarah gasped, the denial thick and desperate in her throat. "Liam said he handled the accounting. He said the logistics company absorbed the losses. He promised me nobody would ever look at my personal devices." "Liam is a terrible businessman and an even worse criminal," I replied. "He forged my signature on a commercial pledge to cover your illicit debts. He handed my grandmother's diamonds to a shadow lender to protect your country club reputation. Did you honestly believe I would sit in a hospital bed and let you finance your gambling addiction with my life savings?" "You promised me," Sarah screamed, pulling the phone away from her mouth to direct her fury at her husband. "You swore you erased the routing numbers. You exposed me to federal prison." "I did it for you," Liam shouted back, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "I committed felony bank fraud to save you from bankruptcy. You burned through the operating accounts playing digital baccarat while I lied to the vendors. You stole from your own family," she shrieked, the sound of another object smashing against a wall echoing through the receiver. "You are a failure. Your company is a joke. I am filing for divorce this afternoon. I will tell the federal prosecutor everything you did. I will testify that you coerced me into hiding the money." The alliance was dead. The Golden family, built upon a foundation of mutual entitlement and shared secrets, was cannibalizing itself in real time. Without my silence to act as their protective shock absorber, their inherent selfishness turned inward. They were no longer a united front. They were two terrified criminals, desperately trying to throw each other overboard to survive a sinking ship. "I will freeze your personal accounts," Sarah threatened, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "I am calling my father's attorney. I will take the house, the remaining equity, and I will leave you to face the commercial bank alone." "You cannot take the house," Liam yelled, the panic reaching a fever pitch. "The feds locked the deed. We own nothing." I reached forward and pressed the red button on my screen, severing the connection. The sudden silence in my office was profound and deeply satisfying. I had introduced a catastrophic domestic crisis into the antagonist camp without ever raising my voice. I let their own greed, their hidden vices, and their profound incompetence execute the destruction. Sarah would spend the next 2 years trapped in vicious, expensive litigation, fighting federal tax evasion charges, while simultaneously battling Liam in divorce court. Liam was stripped of his wife, his vehicle, his corporate entity, and his stolen cash. The secondary threats were neutralized. The accomplices were paralyzed. There was only one target remaining on the board. Patricia still possessed her pristine social reputation. She was desperately clinging to the illusion of her superiority, hoping to quietly manage the bank foreclosure behind closed doors. It was time to deny her that quiet exit. It was time to drive to the country club and execute the final public dismantling of her curated life. The spring gala at the Oak Ridge Country Club was the pinnacle of the suburban social calendar in northern Indiana. It was an event engineered to project flawless prosperity. The grand ballroom featured vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with imported silk drapery. Waitstaff in immaculate white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. The membership fee required to walk through those heavy mahogany doors was exorbitant, designed specifically to keep the harsh realities of the working class firmly on the outside. For my mother, this ballroom was her true sanctuary. It was the only church she attended with religious devotion. She believed that as long as she could sit at the center table, wearing a designer gown and sipping vintage wine, her reality remained intact. The impending bank foreclosure, the frozen corporate accounts, the shattered remnants of her favorite child's marriage, all of those disasters could be temporarily banished simply by maintaining her proximity to power. I parked my rental vehicle near the edge of the sprawling, manicured golf course. I turned off the ignition and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. The clothing concealed the residual bruising across my ribs. My physical recovery was nearly finished, allowing me to move with a steady, confident rhythm. I picked up the sleek manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside were the finalized civil lawsuit filings for financial abuse of a vulnerable adult, paired with the official notice of intent to foreclose, printed on the bank's thick, watermarked letterhead. I walked toward the grand entrance, bypassing the valet stand. The cool evening breeze carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine. The heavy oak doors yielded to my push, and the ambient noise of the gala washed over me. A jazz quartet played a low, rhythmic melody in the corner of the room. The clinking of fine crystal and the murmur of polite conversation created a thick, insulated atmosphere. I navigated through the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos. Nobody questioned my presence. When you wear an expensive suit and walk with quiet purpose, people naturally assume you belong. I scanned the circular tables draped in heavy linen until I located my target. Patricia sat at table number 1, positioned directly adjacent to the dance floor. She had secured the premier seating arrangement, surrounding herself with the most influential figures in her neighborhood. To her left sat the president of the Homeowners Association. To her right was a prominent local judge. Other wealthy peers filled the remaining seats, laughing and sharing superficial anecdotes. Patricia wore an emerald green evening gown, her posture impeccable, her hair styled into a flawless sweep. She was holding a champagne flute, smiling brightly at a joke the judge had just delivered. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She knew her suburban castle was scheduled for public auction. She knew her bank accounts were draining toward zero. Yet she sat there, desperately clinging to the illusion of her superiority, hoping that pretending the crisis did not exist would somehow make it vanish. I approached the table from behind her chair. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I did not rush. I allowed the anticipation to build a slow, deliberate march toward the execution of her curated identity. I stopped directly between Patricia and the Homeowners Association president. I reached forward and gently placed the sleek manila envelope squarely onto the center of her pristine china dinner plate. The thick paper landed with a soft, distinct thud. Patricia froze. Her hand, still holding the delicate crystal flute, stopped halfway to her mouth. The bright, artificial smile remained plastered across her face for a fraction of a second before the confusion set in. She lowered the glass and looked up, her eyes tracing my arm until she recognized my face. "Good evening, Patricia," I said. My voice was calm, measured, and pitched just loud enough to carry over the light jazz music, ensuring every single person at the table could hear my words clearly. The blood drained from her cheeks with astonishing speed. The emerald gown suddenly looked like a vibrant wrapper covering a hollow shell. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow increments. The surrounding socialites paused their conversations, their attention pivoting toward the unexpected interruption. I apologize for the intrusion. I continued, offering a polite nod to the judge and the association president. I know this is an exclusive event. However, the legal timeline required immediate personal service, and you were not answering the door at your residence. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her teeth clenched together in a desperate attempt to maintain her composure. Her voice barely registered above a whisper. "Take that envelope off my plate and leave." I did not touch the envelope. I let it sit there, an undeniable physical presence interrupting her perfect evening. "I wanted to ensure you received the documents before Monday morning," I explained, maintaining my pleasant, conversational tone. "The liquidators from the commercial bank are scheduled to arrive at your property at 9 o'clock to begin the asset inventory. The notice of intent to foreclose is finalized." The word foreclosure hung in the air like a heavy, toxic cloud. The Homeowners Association president blinked his polite smile, vanishing. He leaned back in his chair, instinctively creating physical distance from Patricia. The judge set his wineglass on the table, his gaze dropping to the manila envelope. The flap of the envelope was intentionally unsealed. A single corner of the bank document protruded from the opening, prominently displaying the bold red lettering of the foreclosure header. Patricia stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake resting on her fine china. She could not breathe. Her entire social existence, carefully constructed over decades of aggressive networking and ruthless posturing, was disintegrating under the bright chandeliers. She was trapped in a cage of her own design. If she screamed at me or caused a scene, she would validate the allegations and invite the security guards to witness her breakdown. If she grabbed her purse and ran, she would look like a fleeing criminal. I also included the civil lawsuit filings I added, ensuring the delivery was complete. The complaint details the financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. The sworn affidavits confirming the forged power of attorney and the stolen jewelry are attached. My legal counsel advised me to hand-deliver the federal injunction directly to you. The silence surrounding table number 1 was profound. The neighboring tables were beginning to notice the unnatural stillness. Whispers started to ripple outward, carrying the scandalous fragments of my statement across the ballroom. The illusion was dead. The prominent socialite was sitting in front of her most influential peers, exposed as a desperate fraud who stole from her own hospitalized son to fund a failing enterprise. I looked down at her. She was paralyzed. Her hands rested flat against the heavy linen tablecloth, her fingers trembling. Her eyes were locked onto the foreclosure notice, wide and vacant. She was experiencing the true devastating cost of her choices. She had sacrificed my life to protect this exact moment, and I had just turned it into a public execution. "Enjoy the rest of the gala," I said softly. I turned my back on the table. I did not look over my shoulder to check her reaction. I walked back through the sea of silk and tuxedos, my pace steady and unhurried. The jazz quartet continued to play their rhythmic melody, the music failing to mask the sudden, intense whispering echoing near the dance floor. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The heavy weight that had rested on my chest since the moment I woke up in the intensive care unit finally lifted. I had reclaimed my assets, dismantled the shadow lender, fractured the golden child's marriage, and permanently destroyed the sociopathic armor my mother wore. I walked to my vehicle, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life. The primary threats were neutralized. The family machine was broken. Now the natural consequences of their actions would take over. Without the illusion of wealth to bind them together, the aftermath would be swift. Liam and Sarah were heading toward a brutal, contested divorce filled with federal tax audits, and Patricia was returning to a home she no longer owned. The bank auction was rapidly approaching, and I needed to finalize the ultimate masterstroke to ensure my mother never forgot who held the deed to her future. The days following the country club gala moved with the swift, irreversible current of a structural collapse. News travels through suburban enclaves faster than wind fueling a brush fire. Within 24 hours of my departure from the ballroom, Patricia became a ghost in her own neighborhood. Her peers, the same people who had toasted her health and praised her fashion choices, severed their ties with ruthless efficiency. In affluent circles, financial ruin is treated like a contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be standing near the blast radius when the federal authorities and the commercial banking liquidators arrived. The familial alliance disintegrated even faster. Without my assets acting as a protective shock absorber, the inherent selfishness of the Golden family turned inward. The panic caused them to cannibalize each other in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Sarah executed the first tactical strike. She did not wait for the weekend to conclude. On Tuesday morning, a new filing appeared on the county family court docket. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. I tracked the public records from my secure home terminal, watching the legal assault unfold in real time. Sarah hired a high-profile domestic litigation firm known for scorched earth tactics. She funded their exorbitant retainer by liquidating her remaining designer jewelry before the Treasury Department could seize her physical assets. Her attorneys filed an emergency ex parte motion, leveraging the active federal tax evasion investigation to freeze whatever meager personal capital Liam still possessed. In their filings, Sarah painted herself as the unsuspecting victim of a deceptive spouse. She formally accused Liam of embezzled corporate funds and explicitly denied any knowledge of the offshore casinos in Cyprus and Curacao. It was a brilliant, cutthroat legal maneuver. She threw her husband directly into the path of the federal auditors to buy her own freedom. Liam was trapped. He could not access his business accounts because the government held the keys. He could not access his personal checking because his wife had placed a judicial lock on the funds. The golden child, who had never faced a consequence he could not charge to his mother, was suddenly penniless. Sarah secured a temporary order granting her exclusive occupancy of their leased townhouse, forcing Liam to pack a single suitcase and relocate to a cheap motel near the interstate. He was fighting a federal tax inquiry and a vicious divorce simultaneously, armed with nothing but a suspended driver license and a ruined credit score. My mobile phone vibrated against the wooden surface of my desk, the screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Liam. I picked up the device and read the block of text. "You ruined my marriage. You destroyed my business and my life. Mom is losing the house because of you. I hope you are proud of what you did to your own flesh and blood." I stared at the glowing words. The psychology of his entitlement was truly staggering. He had forged my signature while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. He had surrendered my grandmother's heirlooms to a shadow lender. He had stolen corporate capital to cover illicit gambling debts. Yet, in his mind, he was the victim. He genuinely believed that my refusal to be robbed was an act of profound betrayal. A normal sibling might have typed a furious response outlining every crime and every lie. I did not type a single letter. Explanations require an audience willing to understand reality, and Liam lived in a permanent state of delusion. I pressed the icon on the screen, deleted the message thread, and permanently blocked his phone number. I set the device back down on the desk. The silence in my apartment was deep and unbroken. That silence was my final answer. He was no longer a threat. He was simply a fading echo of a past I had successfully cut away. While Liam navigated the destruction of his marriage, the commercial lender initiated the final phase of their collection protocol against Patricia. A notice of intent to foreclose transitions into a formal eviction rapidly when the debtor possesses zero liquidity to cure the arrears. Patricia tried to call her country club friends to secure a bridge loan, but her phone calls went straight to voicemail. She tried to hire a bankruptcy attorney, but her secondary mortgage rendered her ineligible for immediate structural relief. On Thursday morning, I drove my rental sedan out to the northern suburbs. I did not park in her driveway. I parked down the street, positioning my vehicle beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and watched the conclusion of her reign. The air was crisp and clear. A white county sheriff cruiser sat idling at the curb in front of her sprawling brick colonial. Two deputies stood on the front porch, their hands resting near their duty belts, maintaining a polite but firm perimeter. A commercial locksmith was kneeling by the grand mahogany front door, drilling out the brass deadbolt. Patricia stood on the manicured front lawn. She wore a simple beige trench coat over a pair of sweatpants, a stark contrast to the emerald gown she had worn just a few days prior. She was holding a single cardboard box containing personal photographs and legal documents. The bank liquidators did not allow her to pack the expensive furniture, the imported rugs, or the fine china. The cross-collateralization agreement she signed encompassed the property and its immediate fixtures. Everything inside the house now belonged to the commercial lender, to offset the $74,000 deficit. I watched the neighbors. The same people who had attended her lavish garden parties were now peering through their sheer living room curtains, eager to witness her humiliation. A woman walking a golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her. The locksmith finished his task. He installed a heavy industrial steel lock set onto the front door, securing the property for the bank. One of the deputies handed Patricia a copy of the final eviction order. He pointed toward the sidewalk, instructing her to vacate the premises. She turned and walked slowly down the paved driveway. She did not look back at the grand foyer or the immaculate garden she had prized above my survival. She walked to the curb, clutching the cardboard box to her chest, and waited for a ride-share vehicle to transport her to a cramped, rented motel room on the edge of the city. I turned the ignition key. The engine purred to life. I shifted the car into gear and drove past her. I did not roll down the window. I did not gloat. I simply drove past the empty shell of a woman who had traded her son for a suburban castle, only to lose both. The family dynamic had consumed itself. The antagonists were scattered, stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their protective illusions. They possessed no resources, no leverage, and no capacity to ever pose a threat to my peace again. The defensive war was officially over. But the strategic board still held one remaining piece. The commercial bank now possessed the deed to the brick colonial. Financial institutions do not retain residential properties. They liquidate them through public county auctions to recover their capital as quickly as possible. The house would hit the auction block in less than 2 weeks, carrying a depressed reserve price to guarantee a swift sale. I smiled as I merged onto the highway heading back toward the city skyline. Patricia assumed her punishment was complete. She believed the worst outcome had already occurred. She had no idea that my anonymous offshore corporate trust had just wired a substantial sum of liquid capital to a real estate broker. I was preparing to attend that public auction. I was going to purchase the very ground she used to walk on, ensuring the final chapter of this conflict delivered a level of poetic justice she would never be able to escape. The Marion County Municipal Building features high ceilings and echoing marble floors. The public foreclosure auction takes place every Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. I did not attend the event in person. I monitored the proceedings through a secure audio feed connected to my retained legal proxy. The auctioneer stood at a heavy wooden podium, reading through a thick stack of defaulted property deeds with the mechanical cadence of a metronome. He reached the docket number associated with the sprawling brick colonial in the northern suburbs. The commercial lender set the opening bid at $76,000. That figure covered the exact principal balance of Liam's defaulted business loan, plus the accumulated administrative legal fees the bank incurred during the collection process. It was a mere fraction of the actual market value. The neighborhood carried a heavy stigma, now tainted by the loud whispers of federal tax audits, frozen corporate accounts, and public humiliation at the country club. The usual speculative buyers kept their hands firmly in their pockets, unwilling to inherit the legal complications of a targeted federal investigation. My proxy raised a numbered plastic paddle into the air. The auctioneer scanned the empty hallway. Going once, going twice. The heavy wooden gavel struck the podium with a sharp, resonant crack. The transaction concluded in less than 60 seconds. The grand foyer, the imported tile floors, and the immaculate landscaping Patricia had prized above my own survival no longer belonged to the bank. The deed now belonged to an anonymous offshore trust, a corporate entity I entirely owned and controlled. This was the pinnacle of structural optimization. I had successfully redirected the bank's collection division away from my personal assets and weaponized it against the secondary guarantor. By allowing the institutional algorithm to execute the foreclosure, the property was legally scrubbed of Patricia's ownership. Purchasing it at the public auction meant I acquired prime real estate for pennies on the dollar, funded by the very capital she had attempted to steal from me. The math was elegant, the symmetry was flawless, but acquiring her former kingdom was not the final objective. True closure required a more personal execution of authority. Following her swift eviction from the colonial estate, Patricia had sought refuge in the only shelter her ruined credit score would permit. She signed a month-to-month rental agreement at a dilapidated extended-stay motel on the industrial perimeter of the city. The establishment catered to transient workers and individuals running out of financial options. The neon sign in the cracked asphalt parking lot flickered endlessly. The exterior paint was peeling from the concrete walls. It was a brutal, unforgiving environment for a woman accustomed to silk drapery and catered luncheons. I tracked her relocation through public utility transfers. When I identified the specific address, I initiated a deep forensic audit of the motel's commercial holding company. The owner was an aging real estate speculator, drowning in deferred maintenance liabilities and tax arrears. He wanted an exit. I provided one. My corporate trust executed a rapid cash buyout of the entire commercial property. The transaction closed on a Friday afternoon. The ink on the deed was barely dry before I exercised my new executive authority. I was now the legal landlord of the cramped, unheated room where my mother was currently hiding. The following morning, a bonded process server drove a dark sedan into the parking lot of the motel. I watched the live feed from the security camera system I had just acquired. The server walked up the exterior concrete stairs to the second floor. He stopped in front of room number 12. He carried a roll of heavy adhesive tape and a single sheet of bright yellow legal paper. The document was a formal 3-day notice to vacate the premises. The stated cause was a change in commercial ownership and the immediate termination of all month-to-month tenancy agreements. The server pressed the yellow paper against the scarred wooden door and secured the edges with the tape. Before turning to leave, the server reached into a long cardboard box he carried under his arm. He pulled out a small bouquet wrapped in cheap, crinkling cellophane. Pink carnations. The stems were uneven, the petals already fraying at the edges. They were the exact same discount flowers Patricia had placed on my hospital tray when she ambushed me in the intensive care unit. The server laid the plastic-wrapped bundle on the welcome mat, directly beneath the eviction notice. I watched the security feed as the server walked back to his vehicle and drove away. 10 minutes later, the door to room number 12 slowly creaked inward. Patricia stepped onto the concrete walkway. She wore a faded gray bathrobe, her shoulders slumped, her posture devoid of any residual arrogance. She saw the yellow paper first. She reached up and peeled it off the wood. I watched her eyes scan the legal text. She read the name of the new holding company. She looked down at her feet and saw the pink carnations resting on the mat. The realization hit her with the physical impact of a falling stone. She dropped the eviction notice. She brought her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking as the reality of the checkmate crushed the last breath of hope from her lungs. The psychological loop was permanently closed. The flowers she had used as a prop to mask her theft had returned to signal her ultimate defeat. She could not run from the consequences of her betrayal because I had quite literally bought the ground she tried to escape onto. I closed the security feed on my monitor. The screen went dark. The operation was complete. I stood up from my desk and walked out of the home office. I took the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage beneath my apartment building. The air was cool and smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. I walked past the rows of generic commuter vehicles until I reached a private enclosed parking bay secured by a heavy rolling steel door. I unlocked the bay and stepped inside. The climate-controlled air hummed quietly. In the back corner of the room, a heavy steel floor safe sat bolted into the foundation. I spun the combination dial, hearing the heavy tumblers click into strict alignment. I pulled the heavy door open. Resting inside the fireproof cavity was the faded black velvet pouch containing my grandmother's vintage diamond rings. They were safe. The legacy of my grandfather remained untouched by the greed of the next generation. I closed the safe and secured the locking mechanism. I turned my attention to the center of the bay. The 1969 Mustang sat under the bright overhead lights, the metallic blue paint gleaming flawlessly. The vehicle was no longer a hidden ghost asset trapped in an anonymous storage unit. It was back in my possession, parked exactly where it belonged. The chrome bumpers caught the light, reflecting the clean, unbroken lines of the chassis I had rebuilt with my own hands. I walked over to the driver's side door and pulled the handle. The heavy metal swung open with smooth mechanical precision. I slid into the driver's seat. The cold vinyl pressed against my back, familiar and grounding. I inserted the key into the ignition. Before I turned the cylinder, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I navigated to the contact list. I found Patricia's name. I did not type a final message. I did not seek an apology or offer an explanation. I pressed the block contact button, permanently severing the digital connection between us. I powered down the device and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I twisted the key. The 8-cylinder engine roared to life, the deep guttural vibration echoing off the concrete walls of the private bay. I shifted the transmission into gear, eased my foot off the clutch, and steered the classic car out of the parking structure. I drove up the concrete ramp and emerged onto the city streets. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the Indianapolis skyline, casting a warm, golden glow across the brick facades of the downtown buildings. I rolled the windows down, letting the crisp autumn air rush into the cabin. My lungs expanded without pain. The residual ache in my ribs was entirely gone. I merged onto the westbound highway, driving straight toward the fading horizon. The open road stretched out before me, clear and unobstructed. I had survived a respiratory failure, a coordinated financial theft, and the combined betrayal of my own bloodline. The ordeal had forged a new understanding of justice in my mind. I did not win by screaming or pleading for fairness. I won through cold, calculated architecture. I leave you with this final truth. When the people you trust attempt to use your life as currency to fund their own survival, do not waste your breath asking them for an apology. Ultimate revenge is not about teaching your abusers a moral lesson they lack the capacity to understand. It is about buying the ground they walk on and then telling them to leave. We often mistake the roof over our heads for the foundation beneath our feet. When we look at a sprawling suburban home with its immaculate brickwork, towering oak trees, and perfectly trimmed hedges, we instinctively assume the people living inside are safe. We assume the structure is sound. But as the story of George Ember reveals, the most dangerous storms do not gather on the distant horizon. They brew quietly in our kitchens, across our dining room tables, and in the invisible daily choices we make when we think nobody is keeping score. The tale of a son dismantling his mother's financial empire is undoubtedly a gripping study in structural leverage and calculated retribution. Yet, beneath the federal injunctions, the encrypted offshore trusts, and the dramatic country club exposures lies a profound, devastating tragedy about the failure of fundamental parenting. It is a stark, unflinching reflection on what happens when the core values of a traditional family, honesty, fairness, and unconditional protection, are traded for the hollow currency of social appearance and willful denial. In American culture, the traditional family structure is often revered as the ultimate sanctuary. It is supposed to be the one place where the transactional nature of the world stops at the front door. We are taught to raise children with a deep sense of family responsibility, instilling the belief that a sibling is a lifelong ally and a parent is a permanent shield. However, the Ember family demonstrates the catastrophic danger of treating those values as a convenient slogan rather than a daily practice. Patricia's text message to her son as he lay in the intensive care unit, "Family helps family," was not an expression of love. It was the weaponization of a sacred bond used to justify a profound betrayal. To understand the collapse of this family, we must examine the architecture of Patricia's parenting. Her fatal flaw was a total absence of emotional awareness, masked by a fierce dedication to image maintenance. She possessed a golden child in Liam and a designated shock absorber in George. True parenting requires the courage to allow a child to face the natural consequences of their actions. In a society that highly prizes self-reliance and personal accountability, shielding a child from their own failures is not an act of protection. It is an act of sabotage. By constantly providing a financial safety net for Liam, Patricia did not teach him how to walk. She merely taught him that someone else would always carry his weight. She allowed him to marry into a facade of wealth, turning a blind eye to the offshore gambling and the systemic rot inside his logistics company. She chose the comfort of a serene holiday dinner over the difficult, necessary friction of holding her eldest son accountable. Conversely, George was punished for his competence. He embodied the traditional American ideals of hard work, discipline, and quiet resilience. He rebuilt a classic 1969 Mustang with his own grease-stained hands. He purchased a home with clean capital. He asked for nothing. Yet in a family devoid of fairness, competence is rarely rewarded. It is simply harvested. Patricia looked at George's independence and saw only a reservoir of resources she could drain to cover Liam's deficits. This dynamic highlights a critical lesson for any parent navigating the complexities of raising multiple children. Fairness does not mean treating every child identically, but it demands an unwavering commitment to emotional honesty. When a parent plays favorites, they do not just elevate one child, they actively devalue the other. They teach the favored child that rules do not apply, and they teach the neglected child that their worth is entirely conditional. Patricia handed an 18-year-old George a pen and asked him to sign a power of attorney, promising it was a safeguard. 14 years later, she used that same trust to strip him of his grandfather's heirloom diamonds while he was suffocating on a ventilator. When a parent sacrifices their emotional awareness for the sake of preserving a pristine social reputation, the family ceases to be a home. It becomes a corporation. And corporations are governed by cold, unforgiving math. George did not destroy his family. He merely audited them. He held up a mirror to the transactional environment his mother had created, and he forced her to pay the exact invoice she had written. The story forces us to look closely at the long-term guidance we provide to the next generation. If we raise children in an environment where secrets are prioritized over truth, where the appearance of success is valued more than the integrity of the work we are building, a house on a fault line, the eventual earthquake is a matter of when, not if. Stories like George's are not cinematic anomalies. They are quiet realities playing out behind closed doors every single day. They are the unspoken tensions at Thanksgiving dinners and the silent resentments buried beneath polite smiles. If you find yourself resonating with the quiet strength of walking away, or if you simply need to hear that you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, then you have found your community. Welcome to Linda Vengeance. We tell the stories of those who stop apologizing for taking up space, those who recognize that loyalty should never be a one-way street. Hit the subscribe button, join our growing community, and let us continue to explore the profound strength of letting the paperwork do the talking. Ultimately, this narrative leaves us standing alone in a quiet room, listening to the rain against the glass, contemplating the invisible ledgers we maintain in our own lives. We are all architects of our family structures. Every conversation, every boundary we set, and every truth we choose to acknowledge or ignore lays another brick in the foundation. Look closely at the people who sit across from you at the dinner table. Are you raising children who know how to stand on their own? Or are you building intricate safety nets that will eventually strangle them? Are you loving your family for who they actually are? Or are you merely managing them to protect the picture you wish to present to the world? The answers to these questions do not arrive with a loud crash. They arrive quietly, years later, in the form of a locked door, a ghost asset, and an empty room. We must all decide before the storm hits whether the house we are building is designed to weather the truth or if it is destined to be sold for pennies on the dollar, leaving nothing behind but a faded bouquet of cheap pink carnations.